My name is Eli Warner. I'm 34 years old and currently serve as a captain stationed at Fort Sam Houston in Texas. This isn't a story about combat, medals, or frontline glory. It's about something quieter, something heavier that I've carried with me for years. My father died at our home in Baton Rouge on a cold Monday morning. He was sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of unopened mail and a half-empty cup of coffee that had gone cold. At first, I thought he was asleep. That was easier to believe than the truth. The doctors said it was cardiac arrest, probably stress-related. But I knew better. He had spent 30 years training cadets at the military academy, mentoring officers, giving everything he had to the system. And then they phased him out like he was nothing. No official dismissal, no ceremony, just small cuts. They removed his name from the instructor roster, gave his classes to someone younger, stopped inviting him to briefings. They called his methods outdated. Too empathetic, they said. Too human. At the funeral, I watched men in uniform say he was one of the good ones, that he made them better. But none of them stepped in when it counted. None of them saw how he faded, little by little, until he just stopped showing up. I didn't make a scene. I didn't scream at anyone. But in that moment, standing beside his casket while the honor guard folded the flag, I made a promise. Not revenge, just clarity. I would make someone feel what he felt, not with weapons, with truth, with consequences. My father was Colonel Nathan Warner. He wore his uniform like it was stitched into his skin, crisp and perfect, even on Sundays. Discipline was never about control for him. It was about respect, about holding yourself to a standard so you could lift others. He taught with patience, corrected with kindness, and believed in the long game of character. His cadets remembered him not just for what he taught, but for how he made them feel seen. That kind of leadership used to matter, but the academy changed. New faces brought new philosophies. Colonel Brenda Huxley stepped in as deputy director, and everything shifted. She didn't confront my father directly. That would have taken too much effort. She restructured course rosters so his specialty seminars were reassigned. She invited junior officers to meetings he'd once led and left his name off the calendar. When she did speak to him, it was in passing, with vague comments about alignment and modernization. She said, his evaluations felt too narrative, not data-driven enough. His leadership style was described as overly personalized, lacking operational distance. That phrase stuck with him. Operational distance. Like empathy was a weakness. He stopped shaving on weekends, stopped walking the perimeter after morning coffee. He told my mom he was just tired, that he needed to step back and let the new leadership try their way. But I could see the weight in his shoulders. His office door stayed closed more often. He started forgetting things, not big things at first, just small routines. He didn't talk about the academy anymore. When he finally handed in his resignation, there was no ceremony. Just a quiet email and a box of plaques he didn't hang up again. A man who spent 3 decades teaching honor, loyalty, and purpose was made to feel obsolete in under 6 months. He didn't say it, but I knew it broke something in him. Not all at once, just small cracks, spreading slow and silent. He died quietly. But he didn't die of age or chance. He died carrying the silence of being discarded. And the person who made it happen didn't even notice. It rained the morning of the funeral. Not hard, just enough to make the air feel heavy and the ground soft under our shoes. My mother didn't speak much. She held her umbrella like it was the only thing keeping her upright. The ceremony was short. A few words from the chaplain. A folded flag. The sound of taps echoing over the grass. They called him a mentor, a patriot, a man of discipline and dignity. I didn't feel any of it. I stood there, staring at the casket, thinking about all the mornings he spent ironing his shirts and reviewing lesson plans, about how he kept a photo of his first cadet class on his desk, even after the academy forgot his name. Across the field, I saw a woman in a dark coat drop a single white rose on the edge of the burial plot. She didn't stay long, just turned and walked off without looking at anyone. Later, I learned she was Colonel Huxley's aide. My mother noticed too. She didn't say a word, but I saw it in her eyes. That cold knot of pain that settles when you realize someone outlived their purpose in the eyes of others. I clenched my fists so hard my nails left marks. I didn't cry that day, not because I didn't want to, but because the grief had turned into something sharper. Not rage, just resolve. A clear, steady pulse of knowing that someone had to be held accountable. I wasn't going to fight Huxley the way she fought my father. I wasn't going to scream or demand recognition. I was going to study her system, learn it, enter it, and then, slowly, make her feel what she made him feel. That quiet erosion of worth, the slow drift into irrelevance. I would let her undo herself, not out of revenge, but because consequences matter. And I owed my father at least that. I enlisted 6 months after the funeral. Not out of impulse. I had a plan, and it started with understanding the very system that pushed my father out. The one Colonel Huxley operated so efficiently. My early years were spent moving through supply divisions. I stayed in the shadows, asking questions without raising eyebrows, watching who got promoted and why. The logistics chain fascinated me more than weapons or tactics ever could. It wasn't glamorous work, but it gave me access. Access to contracts, supplier protocols, operations data. I saw how influence didn't live in medals or headlines, but in quiet decisions. Who signs what? Who approves delays? Who reads the fine print? Colonel Huxley had been promoted to Director of Joint Logistics Command by then. She oversaw global operations, and her name carried weight. But what I noticed most was how she operated from a distance. Delegation was her armor. She never gave direct orders when plausible deniability would do. She surrounded herself with rising stars who owed her favors, made others enforce her decisions. It was brilliant, efficient, and vulnerable in ways she never realized. Over the next decade, I rotated through foreign assignments. Germany, South Korea, Turkey, not by accident. I wanted the exposure. I wanted to see how our systems interfaced with allied supply chains, learn where the pressure points were. I built relationships, not flashy ones, just steady, respectful partnerships. A repair captain in Ankara who kept things running through blackouts. A logistics planner in Seoul who worked double shifts when nobody was watching. I made sure they knew I listened, that I remembered names, that I cared about fair treatment, especially when things went wrong. People like that don't forget kindness, especially in a system where they're often seen as disposable. At night, I kept records, patterns, who got sidelined, what contracts failed and why. I wasn't collecting dirt, I was mapping fractures, testing how the system bent under strain. I started to see it like a living thing. A single bottleneck could slow an entire base. A misrouted order in Guam could ripple through half a hemisphere. The network was stronger than one person, but not immune. I never lost sight of that. By the time I hit my 10th year, I wasn't just part of the machine. I understood it better than most. I could see where it breathed, where it cracked, and where someone like Huxley had left blind spots. I didn't rush the plan. That would have made it fragile. It had to grow under the surface. Strong roots, quiet timing. My goal was never to break the system. It was to remind it who kept it alive. For years, I kept my eyes open, not just on how things worked, but on how they failed. When I was assigned to negotiate supplier agreements, I treated it like planting seeds. Not flashy clauses that people noticed, but small protective language tucked into standard paperwork. I built trust with foreign vendors, ones who had been burned more than once by big contracts and broken promises. A parts supplier in Manila who had waited months for payment only to be dropped without reason. A logistics partner in Warsaw who had lost entire shipments when an order was quietly rerouted mid-contract. They told me their stories not because they wanted pity, but because they wanted someone who listened. I learned what hurt them most wasn't money lost or deadlines missed. It was feeling disposable, treated like a number in a ledger. That weighed on me, Not because I was seeking leverage, but because I knew respect mattered. So I started adding clauses that sounded normal on the surface. Standard language about coordination rights and mutual departure conditions. Buried deep in the legal text, where most people skimmed without reading. But these clauses had teeth. If a supplier was terminated without cause and others were treated the same, it allowed them to walk together without penalty, not collusion. Just shared protection. I didn't announce it. I didn't tell Huxley or anyone else what I was doing. On paper, it looked like a precautionary measure. Reasonable, fair. Who could argue against fairness? But the moment someone tried to trigger those rights, the system would fold in a way no single voice could dismiss. There were times I questioned myself. Was this manipulation? Was I playing a dangerous game? Every time I thought about it, I remembered the Manila supplier whose workers were left without wages. I remembered the Warsaw team scrambling to pay rent. They weren't asking for charity. They wanted contracts that meant something. So I kept going, clause by clause, contract by contract. With each signature, I tightened the web just enough to make it powerful but not obvious. Legal language that looked mundane to an inattentive eye, but was a lifeline to someone treated unjustly. No one ever commented on those clauses. Not Huxley, not the board, not the procurement office in Washington. They were buried where they wouldn't raise alarms. And that was the point. I wasn't building a bomb. I was building balance. A way for the system to remind itself that people matter. By the time anyone noticed, it wouldn't be a single vendor walking away. It would be a network, a cascade. And that would be the day the system met its mirror. Quiet, coordinated, and completely unavoidable. The email came through at 6:42 a.m. I was already at my desk, as usual, reviewing field reports from Okinawa and Djibouti. The subject line was short. Termination order, Tier 3 vendors. I opened it. Read it twice. Huxley had pulled the trigger. 5 vendors across Europe and Southeast Asia were dropped in one sweep. No reason given. No warning sent. Just an order to discontinue and reassign. She called it a strategic realignment. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen. 10 years of groundwork had just been set in motion by a single decision she probably made over coffee. I didn't feel excited. I felt steady. Like a clock striking the hour it was built to reach. I picked up my phone and started calling. One by one. The Warsaw office first. They were calm, prepared. They had been waiting for this call. We confirmed the date, the terms, the clause. No hesitation. Manila came next. Then Bratislava, then Kuala Lumpur, then Lisbon. All of them said the same thing. We're ready. Just give us the signal. It wasn't a rebellion. It was a right. One they signed for years ago and trusted would matter someday. By noon, the system began to stutter. Distribution logs showed gaps. Delivery confirmations were marked incomplete. Order tracking started bouncing errors. Maintenance teams on bases reached out asking why key parts hadn't arrived. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. By the end of the day, 3 domestic suppliers called our division in a panic. They couldn't complete assembly without the international components. One even suggested black market alternatives. I said nothing and forwarded the call log to headquarters. Huxley didn't respond at first. She probably thought it was a glitch, a delay, something someone else would fix. But by day 3, she was in every meeting. By day 5, she was issuing temporary contracts to backup suppliers. They refused. The terms were unstable. No one wanted to be next. I was called into a logistics summit on the 7th day. 17 officers, 2 procurement lawyers, and 1 general sat around a table with coffee and concern. I brought a folder. Inside were copies of every clause, every email, every approval signed over the last 6 years. No one interrupted as I explained how the system had created the perfect environment for collapse, not sabotage, not disloyalty, just the fulfillment of what was always allowed to happen. At the end of the meeting, General Rains asked if there was a way to fix it. I told him the only way forward was through restoration, not control. The vendors didn't want money. They wanted to be treated like partners again. I walked out without fanfare. No applause. No headlines. Just a quiet hallway and the sound of printers running behind office doors. I didn't smile, but I didn't feel regret either. That was the day the system cracked, not because someone attacked it, but because it forgot the people who kept it alive. And those people had finally remembered what they were worth. Within 72 hours, everything started to break. Not violently, not all at once, but like a structure, losing tension beam by beam. Depots reported shortages, not of weapons or food, but of the things that made everything else possible. Brackets, wiring harnesses, cooling systems for base generators. The system tried to route around the missing parts, but the backups were never designed for that kind of load. Supply officers began calling one another, asking if they had heard something, seen something. The answer was always no, but the silence said enough. Commanding officers started sending up reports. Tactical readiness was impacted. Maintenance delays stretched from hours to days. Training simulations were postponed. Bases that used to run like clockwork now felt like waiting rooms. Systems threw errors no one could trace. Huxley responded the only way she knew how. She used words: alignment, optimization, strategic recalibration. She issued memos with confident headers and vague promises. But inside, the panic was growing. She tried to source emergency vendors, but the good ones had walked. The ones left either lacked capability or refused her terms. I kept my head down. I filed my reports on time. I showed up early to meetings and stayed late. I didn't gloat. I didn't comment. I just watched. On the 10th day, I was called into a classified session. 10 people sat around the table. Brass. Legal, civilian advisors. No one looked up when I walked in. I placed a single folder on the table. Inside were copies of every agreement, each coordination clause, each signature, the legal foundation for everything that was unfolding. I didn't speak for long, just explained how those clauses had been introduced, reviewed, and approved by multiple offices over multiple years. Someone asked if this was sabotage. I said no. Sabotage implies secrecy and malice. This was accountability. The system had agreed to these terms, and now it was learning what they meant. One of the younger generals leaned back in his chair and looked over at Huxley. She didn't speak, just flipped through the folder with a face that said she was reading something for the first time, even though it had been in plain sight for years. No one yelled. No one slammed a fist on the table. They didn't need to. The weight of what had been lost was already too heavy. I left that room without ceremony. No orders were given. Not yet. But the tide had shifted. Not because I forced it. Because the people who had always been ignored finally had the power to say no. And they used it. The room was quiet when I laid out the last document. A final supplier testimony, signed and notarized. It wasn't dramatic, just a clear statement of intent. They would return. They would restore flow, but only if Colonel Brenda Huxley was removed from all leadership roles. It wasn't phrased as revenge. It was a condition, a professional boundary from professionals who had been burned too many times. They didn't want apologies. They wanted distance, and they wanted dignity. General Harrison read it twice. He didn't ask questions. He had already seen the damage. His voice was steady when he turned to Huxley. He informed her that effective immediately, she was being reassigned to administrative oversight in an advisory capacity. No command, no sign-off authority. Huxley didn't speak. She didn't fight it. Not because she agreed, but because she finally understood. She had spent years designing a system that obeyed her in silence. Now that silence had turned. After the meeting, I gathered my notes and stepped into the hallway. The air felt different, lighter somehow. Not triumphant, just still. She caught up with me near the elevator. She asked if this was all about my father. Her voice wasn't angry, just tired. like someone searching for a reason that would make it feel less like her fault. I looked at her for a long second, told her it wasn't about revenge, it was about truth. About what it feels like to be erased by someone who never bothered to understand the value they discarded. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't blame her. I just stated what happened. Slowly, clearly, like reading back the minutes from a meeting she had chosen not to attend. She didn't reply, just stood there, her eyes darting like she might speak again, but didn't. And then she walked away. No one followed her. That was the last time I saw her. Not at a hearing. Not in a command tent. Just a quiet corner of a hallway that smelled faintly of printer toner and recycled air. In that moment, she didn't look like a villain. Just someone whose power had expired. I didn't feel victorious. There was no applause waiting for me. No medal. No speech. Just a quiet office, the hum of ceiling lights, and a chair that still creaked when I leaned back to think. This was never about taking someone down. It was about restoring something that should have never been lost. My father didn't ask for recognition. He asked for respect. And when that was taken from him, piece by piece, I knew I couldn't let it end that way. I remembered his voice more in silence than in sound. The way he cleaned his boots even when no one was watching. The way he held doors open for junior officers and knew the name of every supply clerk. He didn't lead with noise. He led with care. After the collapse, I didn't celebrate. I went back to work, vendor by vendor, call by call. I let them speak. I took notes. I didn't promise perfection, but I promised accountability. And that was enough to start over. Morrison's reputation shifted slowly, not because I asked it to, but because enough people saw that trust could be rebuilt, that contracts could be honored, that fairness could be policy, not charity. Some of the vendors came back with conditions. That was fair. Some never returned. That was fair too. I didn't blame them. Not everyone gets another reason to believe. But those who did became the foundation of something new. I kept my father's photo in the top drawer of my desk. Not framed, not displayed, just resting between folders. A reminder, a weight, a promise. When I opened that drawer late at night, when everyone else had gone home, I sometimes whispered what I never got to say at his funeral. I kept my word. I made it mean something. Not because I wanted to hurt anyone, but because dignity should never be optional, and people should never be invisible. That's why I did it. And if I had to do it again, I would, quietly, completely, without needing anyone else to know.